Some of my favorite unsolved mysteries have pieces of media that you listen to or watch in an attempt to figure things out further, only for these clues to add a whole other level of chilling uncertainty. From strange final phone calls from people right before they vanished without a trace, or videos of assailants who were never brought to justice, these clues only bring you deeper down the rabbit hole and leave you with a sense of the unknown that penetrates deeper than the usual unexplained event. Air Force Captain Gary Sudbrink decided to visit his parents in New York while on leave from his post, deciding fairly quickly on this trip without really telling anyone about it. While waiting in line at the airport in Texas, a man approached Gary and began making casual conversation with him. As they began calling out the rows of seats for people to board, the man pulled out a small notepad and wanted to write down Gary's name. Gary said no, and the man responded, "Don't worry, you won't get in trouble." Gary initially didn't make anything of it. It seemed like just a nosy person desperate to make a friend. When Gary found his seat on the plane and settled in for the flight, another man sitting to the right of him also struck up conversation. A man then approached this new conversationalist and told him he was sitting in his seat, showing him his boarding pass. The man moved into the middle row, closer to Gary, and continued the conversation. When yet another person confronted the man about sitting in the wrong seat, he moved again, only before asking Gary what his name was, just as the man with the notepad did. He then took up his designated seat, further away from Gary. Gary was discomforted by the insistency of these characters and had someone look at his apartment in case these questions were in the service of an attempt to rob his place while he was out of town. On February 8, 1993, Gary landed and called a friend and told him what he was up to and that he arrived safely. This friend then said Gary called him a day earlier and said he arrived then. This really weirded Gary out. He had no recollection of making such a call, and even if he did, it was inaccurate. The friend noted that Gary seemed rather abrupt in this call, and he assumed Gary had come down with some sort of sickness, as his voice sounded very hoarse and had a flat affect. Arriving at his parents' house, Gary then received another call around 10:30 p.m. that would escalate things beyond the realm of what's considered just out of the ordinary. Gary began recording this call shortly after it began, due to the voice's creepy tone and nonsensical attempts at conversation. Here is an excerpt from the call.
So how long are you going to be back from Texas?
How long?
You're being impersonated by the other voice.
Right. When am I coming back? Is that your question? Okay, there was a break. Hold on. You want to know when I'm coming back to Texas? Oh, is that your question?
So how long are you going to be back from Texas?
How long am I going to be back from Texas? That question doesn't make any sense.
By the other voice.
Okay. I'll be coming back eventually. I can't tell you when. You should know that question, the answer to the questions, because you seem to know more about me than I do. You know what I'm saying?
Are you an intergalactic person?
Are you a space alien?
Sounds like you hung up.
I can't believe this.
The voice says you are being impersonated by the other voice a few times, which may relate to the call Gary's friend received that Gary had no recollection of making. The caller also asks nonsensical questions like, "So how long are you going to be back from Texas?" as if to let Gary know that they know his location, but do so in a way that seems to ignore basic grammatical composition and just comes off as intimidating to repeat something like that in such a way. Gary's father, who had witnessed unidentified flying objects in the past, asked the caller, "Are you an intergalactic person?" only for the caller to hang up. This call leaves me with the sense that the caller really didn't comprehend the responses to his questions and was asking them in a way where he didn't care about the answers. Maybe the quote, "other voice" which the caller claims to hear was blocking out Gary's answers, or maybe the caller was unable to ascertain which Gary was the real one and which was the impersonator. But simply asking the question again doesn't seem like a proper way to distinguish between the two. The language here is worth noting as well. This voice doesn't refer to the other voice as another person, it just says voice. Could the voice we're hearing actually be trying to warn Gary about the other voice? The other voice isn't heard in any of the calls. Listen to the next call Gary received on Monday, February 8th, 1993 at 11:10 p.m.
Keep an eye in the sky, he said.
Keep an eye in the sky?
Yeah.
Can I talk to him? I had a sighting.
Okay, hold on. Say that. Repeat that again. Please repeat. Okay.
Near Orion.
Near Orion.
Holy mackerel. Tonight or this one when?
The full moon.
They told
Double from here.
Repeat.
Tell him I like his phone.
Okay. Repeat last word. I'm hearing static.
Tell him I like his phone.
He hung up.
This one begins with the mysterious stranger sounding muffled and slow. Some have pointed out that it seems like whatever is making these statements is powering down or running low on batteries or something. As a result, this one is harder to make out, but as this one goes on, it just gets more and more bizarre. Veering from the repeated line of questioning, the voice says, "The full moon, keep an eye on the sky, show double of you, and near Orion." Gary's father had 2 UFO encounters, as I mentioned earlier, and at this point he's very much convinced that Gary is speaking with a being somehow related to these events. Gary, on the other hand, seems to be stuck between thinking this is something otherworldly or just a prank. Yet another call comes in at 11:38 p.m. that night.
Hello? Okay. Should I go out right now? Right now? Okay, see, I'm not sure where Orion is now, but we'll go outside. It would show double from me. Repeat that again?
This one has the same phrases as the last call and is kind of difficult to make out. People have noted that the repeated phrases have a similar tone of voice, and what we're hearing may actually be a soundboard of sorts, or at least a cassette player being rewinded and played back at a different speed. This would account for why it's losing power as time goes on, yet on Tuesday, February 8th, 1993, the next day, another call came in at 10:21 p.m., which contains a seemingly more energetic machine or entity.
I have to think about that. I'd like to see you.
Hey, let me tell you something. I've been listening to you, and I've had contacts with you.
Government interference? You have? Please explain what type of interference. Okay.
Visitations to be disrupted by them. Appears. Sun will rise from dark side of world. No. sun will rise from the dark side of the moon.
Okay, what branch of the government? What should I do?
Beware. Government interference. Visitations to be disrupted by them.
Okay. Is that good for me or bad? They hung up.
The re-energized voice is able to expand upon different things, but these new details only add to the mystery. The new statements heard are, "We come to be within this planet, to be contacted, government interference, and presentation is to be disrupted by them." To me, this plays towards the fact that these messages were recorded and played back at a slower speed, as they seem to be working off the previous calls where Gary's dad mentions a possible extraterrestrial explanation. Some details being kept out of this story rubbed me the wrong way. Gary's dad is never given a name in the countless recollections you can find on the internet of this mystery, which seems odd to me. Admittedly, a lot of the UFO-related accounts from back in the day do have details seemingly lost to time, but Gary Sudbrink made an appearance on the Strange Brews podcast in 2020 and still didn't elaborate too much on the previous UFO encounters he and his dad apparently had, describing them now as strange encounters with helicopters that in one case hovered sideways. It wasn't until I found a comment on a now-deleted Reddit post about the calls that my suspicions were confirmed that there may be something fishy about Gary's dad. User Ario62 linked to a section of a book titled Long Island Oddities by John and Laura Lita that describes Tom and Bill Sudbrink, who worked for the now-defunct UFO organization called the Long Island UFO Network, and how they claimed to fly a remote-controlled plane with a camera attached to it over an alleged UFO crash site in South Haven, Long Island. Looking into this further, this alleged crash is mentioned in a Washington Post article named Out There, but this source says that John Ford, head of the Long Island UFO Network, claimed it was simply filmed by a fireman who was responding to a fire that was brought about by the UFO's impact. Even another explanation is given in the Long Island UFO Network's magazine called the Long Island UFO Update, Volume 3 specifically, says that John Ford received this strange video in the mail from a Department of Defense systems analyst. The final page of this newsletter has a single expanded frame allegedly from this video, but I'll be honest, I genuinely can't make out a thing outside of a person standing to the right of the frame. The May 1990 edition of the MUFON UFO Journal was also linked by user Ario62, which was very skeptical about the tape and its depictions. While this tape appears to be yet another piece of lost media surrounding the UFO phenomenon, it apparently depicts alien bodies being recovered from the site. John Ford, president of the Long Island UFO Network, toured around with this now obscured and seemingly unconvincing tape claiming the crash may be, quote, possibly one of the greatest events in the history of man. A Washington Post article even mentions that vice president of the Long Island UFO Network, Steve Iavarone, claimed to have received menacing phone calls with computer-altered voices. This slight diversion from our subject at hand concludes with a shocking criminal conviction. John Ford, president of the Long Island UFO Network, eventually went to prison for conspiracy to commit murder, criminal solicitation, and illegal possession of radioactive materials and reckless endangerment for a plot to assassinate politicians for supposedly covering up UFO incidences. It's also worth noting that he was found unfit to stand trial and served out his sentence in a mental institution. This scandalous conspiracy and its fallout, as well as the fact that the UFO tape was widely believed to be a hoax, may be why Gary Sudbrink doesn't want people to know too much about his father's UFO encounters. But is Tom and Bill Sudbrink really related to Gary? I couldn't find much info on any of them, and yet some people online are speaking about it with a strange certainty. Maybe it's a blind spot on my part, but I just want a definitive link so I can know for certain. If this is the case, it would make sense that the whole strange phone calls scenario was just another elaborate hoax guided by his father and uncle, who appear in the calls. Or were the calls government agents hassling the Sudbrinks for their connection to John Ford, or maybe even their efforts to showcase the UFO crash in South Haven? Still, the murkiness remains. The takeaway from this excursion into the murk is that when you hear of a story told time and time again in a similar fashion, try scratching the surface. What you may find is that it exists in a vacuum for a reason. Okay, so that's what I have on these strange calls. Now my next video is going to cover a number of UFO cult VHS tapes. I'm going to be breaking down them and really explaining the events that they led up to, and I hope you join me on that one. And be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and have a great day. Thanks for watching.